So Claude Code has gotten incredibly stupid. Nick, we're going to talk about what's been described as the enshittification of Claude. People thought they ordered Albert Einstein and Forrest Gump turned up. Then we've got a few things we're going to have a look at on the Claude legacy. But first of all, dude, have you been noticing the change in Claude? I've been seeing this everywhere. A lot of people have been talking to me about it. I'm seeing it in my comment section. Have you experienced it, Nick?
I can't say that I haven't experienced changes in Claude's intelligence, but I'm unsure of how much of the change in intelligence is due to the model provider themselves versus the way that I'm using it times a few coincidences. So hear me out here. Recently, we went from Opus at 200K context to 1 million context, right? And one thing that we know is typically the more context that you give a model before you ask it a question, there's sort of like an inverse relationship. Initially, it gets better, but eventually there's so much context, there's so much irrelevant stuff that you start facing context rot, and then the performance goes down. And then you also have a couple of other things where when people started using models like Opus and Sonnet, they didn't really fully understand their capabilities. But over the months and years, we've gotten pretty good at actually using these models to the fullest extent of what they are capable of. And so the barometer by which we are gauging, Claude's ability to execute on our task is quite different now. And typically we have much higher standards today than we did a few months ago. So I'm unsure, just to be upfront with you. I know the entire internet's like, oh, they're dialing back usage so that when they drop their next model, it's going to be that much more impactful. But I'm unsure of how much of that is up to my own usage of it and then my own human biases versus them. Because for the most part, I like the company. I think the company does great things. I'm not sponsored to say any of this, and I'm not like, working with the company in that way. Although I'd be happy to, because that's how much good work I think they're doing. But it just seems very out of character for me that they do a rug pull like that.
I can't perceive of any reason why they would intentionally deprecate the model. I want to pull up a couple of stats, a couple of things. What actually was the powder keg that launched this whole thing off to give people some context, and then we're going to talk on what this means. So on the 2nd of April, the day after the wonderful April Fool's Day, there was essentially a scene director in AMD's AI group. They published some analysis. So essentially what they had was almost 7,000 Claude session files, 18,000 thinking blocks, and around 250,000 tool calls. And her claim was that Claude Code regressed to the point where she could no longer trust it for complex engineering work. The numbers were damning, stop hook violations, blah, blah, blah. It went from 0 before March 8th to 10th to 10 per day on average by the end of March. The number of times Claude reads code before editing dropped from 6.6 on average to just 2. This isn't vibes-based Reddit griping. This is senior engineer at a chip company publishing her logs. So this was, I guess, what would be described as evidence about Claude doing this. Now, Boris, the founder of Claude Code, came back and he had a few things to say about it. And he kind of released a bit of a point that said they changed some of the default settings in Claude. And I just want to call some of that out, actually. And he didn't tell anybody. So they did 2 changes. They moved Opus 4.6 to adaptive thinking by default on February 9th. And on March the 3rd, the default shifted to medium effort. So what Anthropic calls the best balance of intelligence, latency, and cost. The translation is that they lowered the thinking budget by default to save compute, and users noticed because the agents got lazier. I would say as well, Nick, that most people don't really play around with the effort bar. And also, they don't really know what it means. Like, what does max effort mean versus medium level effort? There's no real quantification sits behind that. So I can see how if they just put your default lower, just general nudge theory says that obviously output quality goes down, even if the underlying base performance remains identical, which might lead to a lot of the confusion here.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think also that medium effort change and then just the total number of times that it's feeding in the input and its own reasoning back in kind of in that cyclical manner would definitely lead to a reduction in the model's ability to spot some things. Just reading through reasoning logs myself, because I set my effort on max basically all the time. I have basically an infinite token budget as we know him. Mr. Frickin' Moneybags out here throwing money at whatever bullshit use case I can.
Max level, dude.
No, definitely not. I notice how, 3 or 4 runs in, you start seeing things like, wait, but Nick asked me to do X, but he also wants me to do Y. So how do I gripe with these 2 intervening things? Whereas if you only have like 1 or 2 of these runs, which I'm sure the low, medium, high, and then max efforts are basically like tiered to how many times they're recycling the inputs. Whereas if you only do 1 or 2 runs, like it'll miss on a lot of that stuff. So I can absolutely see that. I think it's probably, like most things, going to be a combination, right? I mean, human beings love black or white stories where the big bad company that sort of has us all by the balls is actually evil. And I think
You're
we've
getting
looked
less.
for,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. You're less because we hate you and we're actually making Ultron in our basement and
Did
we're going to convert you into paper clips. It's like, since when has that ever actually been the case? This is a massive organization now with lots of money being thrown at it and a lot of different incentives as well. So, I mean,
yeah.
whether or not they intentionally did this thing. Also, on the Medium point, they technically did release that update and they told us. They just did so in the Claude changelog. Because I remember seeing it because I scraped the Claude code changelog for some of my videos. And so they did like make that known, but it's like who actually reads the changelog, you know? So a pretty defensible
I think
position on
there's
their
5
end,
people.
maybe less so for us.
Yeah.
Better than 17 people.
And us 2 and 3 of the people read the changelogs on Claude. Maybe some others. Maybe some of our subscribers do. Yeah. I think the story here is the CEO is not sat on a leather-bound swivel chair with a cat on his lap, deciding to reduce the performance of Claude for you for any reason. It doesn't make any sense. Like, obviously, they make so much money from its performance, they wouldn't just, degrade it. I think probably to save on compute costs, like, do most tasks require max? They don't. They just definitely don't. You don't need to bazooka, a paper door. But although we like to do that, obviously, because we like our bazookas and big explosions and various things. But most people don't need the max level. So I think it's fine to move it. But also, how do they communicate that effectively with people? Like, it's so difficult. Like, Claude are shipping so... The thing about Claude Code right now that I've kind of realized in Anthropic as a company is they're shipping a lot, which is cool. They're shipping like pirates, right? Like, every day I turn on my desktop app, it looks different, which is wonderful. But I think one of the trade-offs of shipping so quickly is that there will at times be products, which we're going to go into because a lot of stuff we're going to cover in this podcast that I haven't seen people talk about, is that there may be overlap or they may get things wrong occasionally. That is just a consequence of speed, which I think we all have to be happy with. We'd all prefer that Claude's dropping cool shit, right? And occasionally things might drop in the process. So I think that's absolutely fine. I will say that a lot of people are talking about it. I do wonder how many people actually move to the max setting. I did anecdotally hear, just for whatever that's worth, people still finding issues with the max level. But I must admit, I haven't been able to replicate that myself. So I would imagine if there was, I don't think there's any tomfoolery. I think it probably was just a capacity thing. Maybe they've just outgrown it. But I think what Boris has said kind of makes sense. I don't think there's any incentive why they would kneecap their own models. I don't really see that would be the case.
Agreed. I think if you have 2 possible explanations, and one is malicious intent, and then the other is a simple mistake or a combination of mistakes, you're much better off choosing the latter as opposed to the former. The latter is almost always correct.